The remains of the Bear Country section can still be seen on a trail leading between Thunder Mountain and Fantasyland. The tunnel that used to let out onto the old trestle bridge is now looming over a big empty lake. A chunk of the trestle and the track itself was left hanging out of the tunnel initially, and it stayed that way for years until eventually rough weather caused it to tumble down into the lake. I'm genuinely curious as to whether it's still down there. This is a bit spooky, right? The bears are long gone, but when the water level is low enough, you can still look down in the lake and see the jumping mechanical fish that they used to try to catch. I think it's cool that Disney still leaves this effect switched on as kind of a throwback. But we want to turn our attention to that living desert section I was talking about. The living desert scene with all its cute little cacti and its tumbling rocks would comprise most of the land that would eventually become Star Wars Land, and there is a unique quality to it which I would like to discuss. You see, since it was a desert, they couldn't have any sight lines to any of the things around it, and there was a lot of stuff around it. There were trees all around it. There was a huge lush river on one side, and then on the other side is Fantasyland, so if you saw any of that, you wouldn't feel like you were in a desert. So, to create a visual barrier, the entire desert section was dug out to sit roughly 6 to 8 feet lower than everything surrounding it. Initially, after the closure of Nature's Wonderland, the living desert area became a barbecue restaurant and a petting farm, but to build these attractions, they needed to get the land level to the walkways around it so that guests could go into it without traveling over a hill or falling into a pit. So you'll remember when I said that the Nature's Wonderland ride had over 200 animated figures and that only a handful of them, like maybe a dozen tops, would go to Big Thunder Mountain Railroad and the Rivers of America. So what about those other critters? Well, the critters of Nature's Wonderland had deteriorated from age and from years of sitting outside, some of them in water, and with no immediate plans to move them anywhere, they would have taken up a lot of storage space. So legend has it that in kind of a two birds, one stone solution, they decided to just throw all of the unwanted critters into a giant pit in the living desert, pour a bunch of concrete over the whole thing, and never speak of it again. So guests would unknowingly be walking over the mass, unmarked grave of countless mechanical bears. On that note, let's talk about the next attraction to occupy this land. Big Thunder Ranch. The barbecue was all you can eat, and it had live music, and it was pretty popular. At the petting farm, you could meet goats, donkeys, cows, turkeys, the giant horses that work on Main Street, and Jenny.
Hi Jenny, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yes, I worked at the petting farm. I loved the petting farm. The petting farm was not popular. It was a favorite of the young, the elderly, and guests with sensory issues who just wanted a quiet place to chill for a minute. But Disney takes hourly counts of their attractions, and it's not like a petting zoo can compete with Space Mountain. According to my manager at the time, the petting farm had the lowest hourly counts of everything at Disneyland. I'll never forget how, when I talked to him about the impending closure of the petting farm, he told me it wasn't a matter of where are we going to put Star Wars Land, it was a matter of how are we going to replace the petting farm. The petting farm was on some pretty prime real estate because it was at the outskirts of the park, and behind it was just a large empty festival center, a big grassy hill, a barn, and a parade storage building. It was a good space for outward expansion, it just needed a little juggling. The biggest accommodation is they did have to completely reroute the Disneyland Railroad, but in doing so they actually added a lot of scenery and embellishments to the train's river crossing, including a lot of references to Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. We've got waterfalls and beavers and a giant beautiful railroad trestle. I was hyped. Star Wars Land itself even took a page out of the Living Desert's playbook. They wanted clean sight lines, and they also wanted to build tall structures to have good forced perspective and some big alien rock spires without visually disrupting the rest of the park. So they actually carved a large concave area back into the earth and put everything lower than its surroundings. I wonder if they dug deep enough to strike pay dirt and accidentally unearth a lot of animatronic bear and elk skeletons. That would be a fun day on the construction site. Best of all, this land is rich with big train energy. Star Wars Land was not only once occupied by a train, it is also hemmed in by trains on nearly every side. Casey Jr. Circus Train is its closest neighbor to the east, Big Thunder Mountain is to the south, and the Disneyland Railroad is to the west. So Star Wars Land is chugging into the station, and now it just needs its story. Star Wars Land Episode 3. the lore. As with Pandora, the world of Avatar, Star Wars Land is intended to be a fully immersive experience. But unlike Avatar, Star Wars has a large established fan base who care deeply about the canon. So the Imagineers had to make it fit in with everything that came before it, and this was accomplished through a multi-step process. 1. Invent a new Star Wars planet. This gave Imagineers the freedom to make the landscape whatever they wanted to, but also to feature whatever creatures or characters from Star Wars they wanted without disrupting the established canon. So they can have big orangey rockwork that matches Big Thunder Mountain on the Frontierland side, but also have a backway that transitions into forest and rockwork to merge it with Critter Country in the back. They can have bantha milk and porgs and ancient Jedi artifacts. Consequently, Star Wars Land has 4 different names. Star Wars Land, which is what it is. Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, which is what it's officially called. Batuu, which is the planet that it's set on. And Black Spire Outpost, which is the location on Batuu that you are specifically in. Step 2, fire the director of one of your Star Wars movies and replace them with a director who's willing to add an extended sequence that is solely there to establish the existence of trains in the Star Wars universe. This would appease the train spirits and prevent misfortune from befalling your theme park. Step 3, start referencing Star Wars Land in all of your canon material prior to its opening. On Star Tours, I'm basic, don't make fun of me. On Star Tours, they added an ending to the possible carousel of endings that took guests to Batuu.
Oh, Batuu, hell yeah.
Although each of the story segments on Star Tours are randomized, I believe for a good long time this was the only one you could get.
Yes, Batuu. I believe this adventure is just beginning.
Batuu was also featured in the novel Thrawn Alliances. It made a little cameo in the Star Wars Resistance cartoon, and it got its own Marvel Comics series. The story of Batuu is that it is a once great Outer Rim world, which is now used as a stopover for travelers and smugglers on their way out into wild space. It's currently occupied by the First Order, but the Resistance has also set up a base in the very same outpost. That last part is kind of funny because of the proximity of the two organizations. So you have Kylo Ren's big ship, and periodically he will stomp out of it and he's like, "Where's the Resistance?" And Rey is straight up doing photo op meet and greets like a block away. But that's Kylo's problem. He's too focused on his work. If he just walked around the corner to get himself a hot dog wrap, he'd see the Millennium Falcon. It's parked in the middle of the street. But speaking of Rey, her theme park story is even funnier. Sometimes she'll hold still in one place, usually out by the building that's going to be the Rise of the Resistance ride, which is the Resistance base, and also sometimes by the Millennium Falcon photo op area. But they avoid setting up a queue and having people meet Rey one after the other. Instead, she is on Resistance business. The best thing Rey does is if kids come up to her, she will tell them that she's on a mission and she's hiding from stormtroopers, and then she'll take them around on an adventure with her. Then they'll basically just go around the land and hide in doorways and behind garbage cans. In the olden days, this was how all Disneyland characters functioned. They didn't have a sign set up telling you where to meet them, and they didn't form a line. They would just show up and be around, and kids would gravitate toward them. They would just wander the park like they live there, which is what you're supposed to feel like, and sometimes they would even climb onto rides with you. Then the concept of the character meet and greet was recontextualized into an attraction of the park, a rite of passage for little girls wearing matching princess dresses, and a marketing opportunity for your Disney PhotoPass photographers. There are a couple characters who are still free range, like Peter Pan will just wander all over Fantasyland, and Alice and the Mad Hatter still go play musical chairs with kids at the ice cream parlor. But the princesses are so in demand that they built them a dedicated royal hall for photo ops. You line up and then they march you through, and you meet 3 in a row like it's an assembly line, and the character hosts have an hourly quota they're supposed to meet. I understand the need for this. They wouldn't have started doing it if the demand wasn't there. But that never made sense for Rey. And before Star Wars Land opened, they did have a dedicated Rey meet and greet, and she had a little backdrop that they made for her. It was a little room with like a map and a console with buttons, and it's like Rey isn't a political leader like Leia, and she's not bubbly and outgoing like Rapunzel and Snow White, so like why is she in this room holding court with strangers? And none of the performers could do the accent, and you just make awkward small talk. That's one statement I am not going to include a clip to support, because I don't want to just cruelly single out one Rey. But this new thing is such a fun idea, and it's going to make such a better lasting memory for the kids that meet her. I also like the way it kind of reshapes the character's function into an active playmate for kids. It almost discourages adults from approaching her, and like you still can, and she'll even come up to you if there aren't any kids their own, but I think the idea of having her play a little pretend game with you is a good way to establish that boundary, because it should be for the kids at the end of the day. And mostly I like to imagine that episode 9 is going to come out and just have a 30-minute action sequence of Rey wandering a market at a light jog, crouching behind one trash can after another in a seemingly aimless pattern. Also, Rey sure is quick to trust and recruit every single person she runs into on Batuu. Are you sure this is the best way to keep a low profile, Rey? As far as the physical sense of immersion goes, it's fantastic. Disney, as always, has their sight lines down to a science. Like, you can't see anything else while you're inside, and you can't see inside when you're in the other lands, so it doesn't ruin those. I really wish companies like Universal or Knott's Berry Farm cared about this, so you wouldn't get things like a Homer Simpson head from Hogwarts or a roller coaster track in a western ghost town. And all the employees are extremely into it. If you go, just know that basically everybody at the park wanted to work at Star Wars Land. They even made a video surprising people by telling them they got accepted to work there, like they were winning the lottery or something. So definitely don't overlook the cast members as a resource. Like, if you see anything that you're curious about or just have any questions, definitely approach them and ask. They are just as excited about Star Wars Land as you are. A lot of them have made up their own backstories and characters. Like, there was a guy selling me water bottles whose thing was he likes to eat porgs. A lot of them are doing fun space hairdos, and when they go to costuming, instead of having a set costume like everywhere else in Disneyland, they are given a large selection of pieces they're allowed to mix and match, and that's to help them establish their character also.
First guy I've seen with this hat. It's a bold choice, but I respect it.
If you're talking to an employee and they look like they have a minute, definitely ask them questions about their characters or the surroundings or props. Ask them how they feel about the First Order. If you see a blaster mark, ask them how it got there, because odds are they've either made up their own story or it was covered in training and they're excited to show they can remember it. One of my favorite moments was I was in line for the lightsaber experience, and we were in this courtyard and there was a tree with colorful scraps of fabric tied to it. At one point, an employee arrived and started tying more scraps of fabric onto it, and this was opening day, so I was like, oh, it's a designer punching it up, or maybe guests disrupted some of them and he's fixing it. But I'm near an employee, so I just point to this man and I go, what does it mean?
Whoa, that man is tying fabric onto that tree. What does it mean? What does it mean?
Is there any way?
And it turns out it does have an explanation.
This is a wishing tree.
Oh, what do you have to do to make it come true?
Right side.
It just kind of lives on the tree, and as the tree grows and blossoms, your wishes will come true.
I wonder what he's wishing for.
That's the kind of thing that makes the experience really special. As in Avatar Land, nobody is supposed to acknowledge that they're in a theme park or that Star Wars is a movie series. In Avatar Land, the Avatar movie is the documentary, and in Star Wars Land, the Star Wars movies are the legends. This land also, of course, has its own lingo. Bright suns and rising moons are their greetings, depending on the time of day. Somebody was telling me that the planet Batuu has 3 suns and I think 2 moons, and I believe this employee was telling me that they're all out at once. And I don't know enough about space to know if that makes sense. But anyway, that's why they're all about their suns and their moons, because they just have a bunch of them. So it's always on your mind. Wheelchairs and strollers are transports, and my personal favorite, I don't know, is supposed to be only the ancients know, which I have yet to see employed, but I'm very excited for the eventuality. I remember that for people that like clickbait articles, before it opened, everyone was like, well, if you go to Star Wars Land, you better know to call the bathroom the refresher or they won't tell you where it is. It's like, no, customer service still comes first, obviously. It's just clickbait. They call it that, but they obviously still answer you. It's obviously just like if you ask where the bathroom is, they say the refresher is that way, and you understand through context clues. It's not complicated, guys. Definitely use the lingo while you're there because it is fun. I don't make the fun rules, it just is fun. I imagine that working at Star Wars Land, when the crowds pick up, is going to end up being a very stressful experience with a lot of unhappy guests. I worry that as guest satisfaction issues arise, they will start discouraging their employees from being so in character. Or the employees will stop having so much fun and not be so into it, or they will simply run through their first crop of employees and not train the subsequent crop of them quite as intensively. If I may hit you with a fun fact, which I love, I was once in a break room and a veteran employee of California Adventure swore to me that when the park first opened, all of the employees of the boardwalk area were asked to affect an old-timey carnival barker accent, like the CEO was just really enamored by the idea of this and asked it of them in training. But nobody was doing it, and the employees were mad at even being asked because it is kind of a big ask. Management was tired of trying to enforce it because they weren't into it either, and it was very quickly just written out. They're like, no, we're not going to do that. I've Googled around about this extensively and tried to find old home movies of the year the park opened, and I've not been able to verify this as fact at all, but I want to believe. Nobody in Star Wars Land is being asked to do carnival barker accents, but I think it is a reality of theme parks that as things begin to age, that level of attention to detail and effort begins to wane as the realities of training and maintenance set in. So that's why it felt very important to me to go to Star Wars Land soon after it opened and catch all those strange and interesting things which might be changed or abandoned later. But how are we getting inside? Star Wars Land Solo, a Star Wars Land story. How are we getting inside?